Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the second session on embodiment today. Thanks for making it to the end of the day and hanging out with us until the reception tonight. We have 4 talks in the session. The second talk is online, so please bear with me as we get that set up. Hopefully I can play it from my own machine. I'm Jeanine Stefanucci, by the way, if you didn't see me this morning. And our first talk, thankfully, are here in the room. So I will hand it over to Irene and Ephraim, who are going to present together. Yay.
Hi. All right. All right, so hello and welcome. I'm Ephraim Schott, and this is Irene López García, and we will present our talk together today. And it has the title, Speaking with Objects, Conversational Agents Embodiment in Virtual Museums. And at this point, I would also like to thank our colleagues and supervisors, Marcel Gohsen, Volker, Bernhard, Benno, Stein, and Bernd Froehlich. For the motivation of this talk, I would like you all to imagine to see this virtual museum through virtual reality headsets. I guess that most of us would agree that virtual reality headsets are a great tool to explore 3D reconstructions because they, first of all, give us all the experience of actually being there, and at the same time they maintain the original sizes of objects and their spatial relations. However, I guess also most of us would agree that just seeing a 3D reconstruction without any more information is probably not really a very compelling idea or experience. So let me give you a short background of this room. This is the famous room designed by Walter Gropius himself, and Walter Gropius was the founder of the Bauhaus school, where Irene and I are from. And he designed this room to showcase the collaboration of the Bauhaus and to show the innovative design of the Bauhaus school at his era. And in this work, we used this reconstruction of the room to explore more engaging ways to present virtual museums. So let us imagine we are standing in front of this wall hanging and we want to know more about it. How should we present such information? And there are a lot of different ways in VR. One could simply be showing text, not very engaging, or we could have an audio guide as we know it from real museums. And of course, we can have tour guides, virtual or real ones. And the nice thing about tour guides is that they allow users to follow up with questions. And this is also why we chose to go deeper into this tour guide idea. And we wanted to also test how well LLMs or conversational agents can fulfill these requirements that a tour guide have, and how can they make it engaging. So this leads us to our research questions. How should such conversational agents be embodied and designed to effectively engage visitors with the information in virtual museums? There has been a lot of research on agent embodiment, and I just want to briefly touch on 2 works that informed our design. And they are by Razayev et al. And by Schmidt et al. And they look both into agent appearances, and I just briefly break down their findings very shortly. So they found that no embodiment or abstract embodiments, here in the bottom left, were less distracting and also had slightly better performance in knowledge transfer. And Schmidt et al. Found that that users prefer to have thematically fitting agents over more generic ones in context-specific scenarios. And this really inspired us to think about our own design for it. And we thought we want to have such an abstract design, but we want to have it thematically fitting. And this is why we came up with this idea. And let me quickly show this to you. So this is our stylized guide, and she's inspired by the Bauhaus artist Oskar Schlemmer, and thus she fits also into our room since it's a Bauhaus room. And since she also has some humanoid features, we thought that she still fits into this familiar role of a tour guide. And these legs also allow her to guide the user through the room. And she thus should act as a third-person narrator with a kind of like giving objective information on the topics in the room. And to complement this idea, we thought we want to have something that is slightly more engaging and maybe bring in some magic in VR. And our idea was to just talk to the objects themselves. And surprisingly, we could not find any other works that have looked into speaking objects, and that's why we followed down this road. Let me quickly show our objects. We had actually 4 objects in the room. Here are 3 shown. And you can see that they all have their own unique animations. And to follow up on that, we also gave them their own personalities. And this helped to give these, to have these objects act as first-person narrators of the space, to give more information on these, on themselves and also on the room. However, this then was subjective, and we hope that this would be engaging to the users because they could kind of get to know all the different characters in the room. For example, the Wagenfeld lamp here in the center, we thought could be arrogant and self-centered. And overall, this whole approach is, of course, inspired by movies like Beauty and the Beast. So let me quickly show you how our setup looked in action. This is the view of a user in our virtual museum, and they can ask questions by pressing a button. And we had a simple feedback mechanism to show in which state the agent is. And once it was recorded, it was sent to ChatGPT and then transcribed to become, so that we get audio back. And then we would have the object's answer.
I am made of natural cherry wood, with parts of me stained in a reddish-brown color. Walter Gropius himself designed me as a key element of its holistic spatial concept for the director's room.
All right. And with that, I would like to give over to Irene to show you how we actually evaluate these 2 embodiment concepts.
Thank you, Ephraim. All right, so to evaluate our embodiments, we performed a user study with a within-subjects design. So each participant learned about a subset of 3 objects by each embodiment in what we called Tour A and Tour B. We had 29 participants. However, in our reports, we excluded one of them because they suffered a fear of puppets, which was triggered by the speaking objects. And by their own judgment, they weren't able to give fair assessment. The way our study went, we had a welcome and a tutorial phase. Then the participant would enter our virtual room with one of the embodiments active. Let's say in this case, it was first the guide. And after the tour, they will fill in a questionnaire about their experience. Then the same procedure happened with the second subset of objects and the other embodiment, so the speaking objects here. And of course, this order was counterbalanced. And to conclude, we had a closing questionnaire. Among the measurements that we took, we counted the amount of questions that the participants asked during the experience. And we hypothesized that the speaking objects will receive more questions than the guide. Our questionnaires included the SUS and Yuqiu questionnaires, as well as the social presence section from Bailenson et al. And here we expected to see an impact of embodiment modality on the scores. Our final questionnaire asked about the preference of embodiment and some feedback, and how many topics of a set list did the user remember. And here we expected to see a correlation with the amount of questions they asked. All right, if we looked at the engagement measurements, we did find that users asked more questions to the speaking objects in the tour portion of the study. However, when we include also other questions that were outside of the objects that we were presenting, users asked the guide about herself or general questions about the room. And therefore, we only partially support our first hypothesis. In terms of remembrance, we found no correlation between the amount of questions and the topics they remember, thus rejecting our hypothesis. In user experience, both embodiments had above average scores in the SUS and the Yuqiu. We found some significant difference in favor of the animated objects in the scales of stimulation and novelty. And they were also perceived to be more sentient and even alive than the guide. Among our observations, we found that some of these speaking objects were more engaging, not only compared to the guide, but also to other objects. So in order to try to understand why this happened, we analyzed the agent responses according to the embodiment using an emotion classifier. So here are the results, but let's focus on two of the objects to make this a bit more clear. If we look at the lamp, for example, we see that her responses were the least neutral among the objects, but showed the greatest levels of admiration, mostly on herself, because she was arrogant. In contrast, the armchair, the responses were highly neutral, and although we induced the emotions of shyness and being introverted, this was nowhere to be seen really in, for example, nervousness or sadness. So this could indicate that the more intense emotions and less neutrality lead to more engaging conversations, and therefore the user is more engaged in the learning experience. Overall, our participants gave positive feedback, and our results showed a good user experience. We observed that each of the embodiments produced different conversations and interactions. To the guide, the users asked more general questions about the room, about the history, and not so much, and maybe less about the objects themselves. She was perceived as reliable, familiar, and because of this, it was easier to get used to the interaction. She was also better at guiding users through the space from object to object because she was walking in the room. To the speaking objects, users directed specific and personal questions, subjective questions, like, for example, what do you think of this room? They described them as fun, as playful, and exciting. And because they varied in their personalities, users felt that they were invited to get to know each of them, kind of that's fostering proactive exploration of each object. Also, their personalities, as we saw, seem to have some influence in their ability to engage. To summarize, in this work, we developed and evaluated two embodiments for conversational agents. The guide and the animated objects elicited different kinds of questions, making each of them suitable for different types of exploration of a virtual space. This leads us to recommend a mixed and customizable approach that allows users to cater to their own needs this experience. It also benefits from the guide's role as a narrator and her spatial guidance, and from the diverse personalities and excitement component of the speaking objects. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and we will happily answer any of your questions.
Questions?
Hi, thank you. Very interesting talk, nice idea. I had a question about, did you thought of adding maybe faces to the objects, like in the Beauty of the Beast and the Beast, to maybe have a more connection between the objects and the user?
Yes, this is definitely a topic that came up also with our participants, and it's definitely something we're thinking for future work, to be able to express even more emotions, what we could not find in purely the text that we received from ChatGPT or even the text-to-speech. Maybe then faces could help in this aspect, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, that was a really awesome talk. So you saw in the results that more intense emotions led to more engagement with the user. Do you think for the objects, if there was like more intense or like less intense animation and movement, would it also affect the engagement with the user?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, I think so. I guess because we had quite easy animation, so we had like welcoming animation that was like, for example, for the chair, like waving his arm. But when they were actually talking to the objects, they were just moving in the speed of the amplitude of the sound that they produced. So it was rather, and that was mixed with the animation itself. But yeah, I guess if we show more animations and like animations that are depending maybe on their character or on their actual response that could maybe increase also attention of the users. That, yeah.
Hi. So I'm particularly interested in the personality of these objects, and I think it's very interesting that they all had different like characters. So users had some incentive to explore. So do you think that this sparked curiosity with the users? So would you expect that the same system but without the personalities would fare worse compared to what you've chosen now with the different personality types?
Yes, I think that if we have more plain responses, kind of like we saw this, the guide was usually then mentioned in the feedback as it was very plain in their answers, and therefore at some point it became boring, or maybe it's also because it's what people are used to. But yes, this not only having histrionic personalities, but also having different characters that it's kind of like going to a party, and somebody mentioned in one of our participants, right, that you just go and you meet this person and you say, oh, this is very fun, and this one, oh, it's kind of dull. So I think there is, the potential is in the different personalities that we can show.
Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next talk is online, so I'm going to try to pull up this and turn on my sound once this is done. Do I need to turn off this mic if I am going to play from the machine, or is it okay? Do we know? Should just be fine? Okay. So the next talk is I Feel Myself So Small, Designing and Evaluating VR Experiences Based on Theories Related to Sublime. And Zhiting is online, so we can ask her questions when this is over. You can't hear that, can you? I think I've... Should I leave the sound? I can't leave the sound off on my computer, can I? This is what I was worried about. It doesn't seem like it is. That's what I asked earlier. Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have questions for Justine, who's online? Hopefully she can hear. No? Justine, I have one. Hopefully you can hear me. Let me know if you can't. Great. So I'm wondering if you thought possibly about the fact that when people experience awe, they often describe a sense of feeling small in the world. So did you think about giving them an avatar to consider embodying that was maybe smaller than their normal body, and they could then maybe have that be more equivalent to how they might feel if they were feeling a high sense of awe?
Sorry for due to some visa issue. Yes, we consider that after we analyze the data, because we think that the avatar we offer them did not influence the intensity of awe they are feeling, is because the avatar is similar to the size of themselves, so which did not alter their perceived size of the surrounding objects. So we tended to maybe design some virtual avatars with different sizes to see whether the size of the body can have influence on their own experiences. So this is a really good question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Oh, yeah, we have another question in the audience that hopefully you can hear from the other mic, but Justine, let me know if you can't. Try speaking from there, maybe.
Does that work? Can you hear me there?
Can you hear him, Justine?
Otherwise, it shouldn't.
Yeah, okay. She can hear.
Okay, excellent. Super interesting work. I was wondering about the sense of embodiment. The way I understood it is that embodiment didn't have a strong or any clear effect on the emotion. So I was wondering whether there might be different ways of embody, or maybe changing the type of embodiment or purposefully designing that one to have an effect. Just seems slightly unusual or counterintuitive that embodiment would not have an effect, or maybe that's true. I don't know. Just wanted to hear a bit more about your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure whether I understand it clear. Is that you want to hear more about the design of our sense of embodiment to associate with this study?
If I come here, maybe you can hear me better. So no, it's more a question, like you found that the embodiment did not have a strong or clear effect on the emotions elicited. So I was wondering whether you can speculate why that might be, or what we might need to do to maybe increase or leverage any potential benefits of embodiment.
It is that the virtual body they
So hello everyone, my name is Antonin, and today I'm going to present the paper Avatar-Centered Feedback, Dynamic Avatar Alteration Can Induce Avoidance Behaviors to Virtual Dangers. So first, let me introduce you to a short video illustrating the problem that we want to address here. Here, the user is performing a metallurgy task in VR. Where they have to heat up a virtual ingot. And as the task is taking too long, they decide to bring their hand deeper inside the oven. And this is actually the problem that we want to address here. The fact that in general, in virtual reality, users often end up engaging in unrealistic and dangerous behaviors. Of course, here the user is not at risk of physical injuries. However, such behavior might still reduce different aspects of the user experience. First, for example, it might reduce the efficiency of various VR applications, for example, in training applications, by habituating the users to wrong movements, or more generally by leading them to experiences that are not planned by the VR designer, which is this one. And in addition, it might also impact the subjective quality of the VR experience by lowering the sensation that the VR experience is actually occurring, is actually real. So let's dig into the existing literature on this subject. So first, most of you probably already know and even experience that in VR, VR can elicit realistic reactions to various virtual dangers, whether it is in terms of behavioral responses, for example, by when a user is walking around a virtual pit instead of crossing it, or in terms of physiological responses, for example, when a fire breaks in a virtual environment, when it triggers heart rate or skin conductance increases. However, we have to note that these effects are not systematic. Usually they depend on the danger, on the user, on the context, and are also often incomplete, as users usually do not respond fully realistically to these virtual dangers. And this is the reason why we can wonder about how we can find different ways that we could further increase these realistic responses toward the virtual dangers. And that brings us back to the limitation which I introduced earlier, with the users bringing their virtual hand directly inside the burning oven. So let's analyze this problem from the perspective of theoretical models of perception in VR. We can consider here two perceptual phenomena that can elicit realistic reaction in VR. First, the sense of embodiment, which leads the user to perceive and behave with the virtual avatar as their own body. And then the plausibility, which describes the user's feeling that virtual elements or events are really occurring. For example, in this case, a virtual fire. So taken together, this sensation leads the users to feel that the virtual risks to their virtual body is actually real. And in this case, for example, it would lead them to avoid bringing their hand directly inside the virtual fire. However, here the problem is that this sensation, we have to notice that the sensation is only elicited a priori, before any interaction with the virtual fire. And it's important to note that, however, when if the user actually experiences an interaction with this virtual danger, usually it doesn't lead to any consequences. And most likely, this absence of consequences will reduce the following sensation of fear to the incoming virtual dangers. And this is why in this study, we wonder how we could elicit a fear of virtual danger a posteriori, after experiencing the interaction with the virtual danger. So in other words, a feedback to the virtual danger. And here I should mention that we are not necessarily interested in hardware solutions such as haptic feedback, because of course we don't want to injure any of our participants, but also because usually haptic feedback are cumbersome, risk-specific to a given feedback, and environmentally costly. So rather we focus here on software solutions. And that's led us to present the avatar-centered feedback, a concept that we formally define as a dynamic alteration of the avatar's virtual appearance or movement in response to its interaction in the virtual environment. So for example, here is an example where you can see the avatar, which is in the cold, relatively far from a virtual fire. And you can see the avatar-centered feedback is taking place with the hand starting to shiver and sorry, I will come back just to show again, the hand starting to shiver and and frostbite starting to display on the virtual hand to show the danger and the feedback to the temperature. And as the hand is comes back close to a source of temperature, the alterations start to reduce to communicate the increase of temperature. This approach, of course, can be applied to numerous other contexts by communicating, for example, a cut, a burn, or even non-dangerous body reaction, for example, excitement. In the paper, we provide a complete framework detailing different types of feedback that can be applied, and I invite you to check them out if you are interested. So, but then we also need to conduct a user experiment to assess the efficiency of this approach. The experiment consisted in measuring the impact of out-of-standard feedback triggered by a fire on behavioral and subjective experience. All of this in a metallurgy scenario. The experiment followed a between-subjects design with 42 participants split between a feedback and a control group, which defined whether they would receive the avatar-centered feedback or not. So let me describe a bit more, show you the illustration of this experiment. First participant had to complete a heating operation. That was sort of the main task, which consisted in heating an ingot in a virtual oven. And participant in the feedback group, as you can see, would present different type of avatar-centered feedback. Their appearance would change in relation to depending of the distance to the fire, with their hand reddening and presenting burn marks as it approaches the fire. Also, it's more subtle, but they will also simulate. They will also present movement alteration with sort of withdrawal reflex movement when a spark would burst inside the virtual oven, which should happen just in a second, just here like this. So that was the heating operation. And just after, they were asked to complete a press operation, which consisted in flattening the virtual ingot with a press by pressing a virtual button that you can see just here. And I will describe in a minute, but basically this task served as distraction to the user to present them later to other unexpected type of danger, which I will present in a minute. You can see here that maybe it's not really visible, but the burns mark remaining on the virtual hand. So the experiment consisted in 6 repetitions of these 2 consecutive tasks, so the heating and the press operation. Then there was 2 sizes of tongues, first long and then shorter, to assess different incentives to get closer to the fire. And then, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of the experiment, participants were presented to 2 additional dangers, which were not mentioned to them before. Here, which were the virtual button that was starting to burst sort of like electric arcs, and a circular saw that was approaching the virtual hand of the user. And here, participants did not receive any feedback about these dangers, and the goal was to measure any potential carried over effect of experiencing before the fire avatar-centered feedback on the general perception of danger in the environment. Specifically, we measured how long they would wait and stay away from the electric arc before finally reaching the button and pressing the button, and how far, and if and how far they would move away from the virtual saw when approaching the virtual hand. So for the measurement, basically we use the user's movement as a behavioral measurement, and a subjective questionnaire about embodiment and plausibility. So we had 2 major hypotheses in this experiment. First, we expected that participants presented to the avatar-centered feedback would demonstrate more realistic responses toward the associated dangers. So danger they would receive feedback from, in this case, the fire during the heating operation, the oven in the heating operation. And then we expected participants of the feedback group to also demonstrate more realistic responses toward other dangers that they did not receive any feedback from, which is the electric arcs and the circular saw. Because as I mentioned earlier, we had the hypothesis that avatar-centered feedback could have a sort of carried over effect over the general perception of danger in the virtual scene. So let's observe the result of the experiment, starting with the behavioral responses toward the virtual fire. Here you can observe the average duration time of the heating operation split between the control and the feedback group, and between the long and the short tongue size. And the most interesting that is that we found that in both tongue conditions, participants in the feedback group spent significantly more time completing the heating operation, meaning that they took more precaution and distance from the oven when performing the heating task. And this is corroborated by this heat map that showcases the average hand position during the task. Again, results split between feedback and control group, long and short tongue size. And on the graph, you can see the outside of the oven on the left and the inside on the right. And the red dots shows the most frequent hand position during the heating operation. And what we can see here, what we can clearly observe is that the feedback group on the top side kept their hands significantly further away from the oven, from the center of the oven. So taken together, these results show that using this concept of avatar-centered feedback can increase realistic behaviors toward the associated danger, the danger that user will receive feedback from. So in this case, the fire. And so now if I switch to the results regarding participant behaviors toward other dangers, so dangers that they did not receive feedback from, the electricity and the circular saw, we did not find any significant differences in terms of like reaction to electricity, but for the distance to that the user will take from the virtual. So we found that in the feedback group, users kept their hand significantly further away from the circular saw when it was approaching their hand. And interestingly, that seems to indicate that avatar-centered feedback can, to a specific danger could be carried over to the general perception of danger in virtual environment. So if you have a feedback to a fire, you may have the sensation that generally you're more vulnerable in the virtual environment, and so be more precautious even to other danger that you will encounter in the virtual scene. I will not elaborate too much on the subjective result here. We did not find any significant difference in terms of embodiment or plausibility. I don't have time too much to elaborate on this now, but I invite you to check out the paper as we discuss the potential causes and the conclusion that can be drawn from these results. There is some limitation, of course, of this work. I think we probably should try to generalize this result to other type of dangers, for example, sort of instant damage type of dangers, or even try to find generic sort of feedback that could be applied to a wider range of dangers. Also to even other interactions that are not injurious, such as fatigue, excitement, social touch. And it would be also interesting to see how much this effect could, how much the time of different VR sessions can affect these results. So finally, to conclude, in the paper, we presented the concept of avatar-centered feedback, a device-free approach consisting in a dynamic alteration of the avatar's appearance and movement in response to the interaction with the virtual environment. In a user study, we demonstrated that avatar-centered feedback could induce users' realistic behaviors toward the associated dangers. And further, we also found that this approach could even present carried-over effect by even impacting behaviors toward other dangers, altering the general perception of dangers in a VR scenario. So thank you very much for your attention. I will stay available to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
I have a question. To be fair, I was part of the control group, so I do know the experiment. But it's more about future works. What kind of generic feedback do you think would work well? Like, you think just notifying users that, hey, you're in danger could be enough? Or do they really need to see the consequences, like the bad ones?
Thank you for your question. I think for this, what I envision is like we could get inspired from, for example, video games or cartoons. For example, in a cartoon, it's not necessarily realistic, but you see when you get hurt, when a character gets hurt, it starts maybe to like get red or something like this. And even if it's not realistic, we understand what it means, and maybe it might be interesting to see how this like more abstract feedback could be applied to have a more generic feedback, both because it could be applied to a wider range of danger, but also because it could also communicate an injury to dangers that does not in the reality have impact on the appearance of the users. If you get sick or poison, you don't have a visual impact on your body, but we could communicate it in a more abstract way. I hope we could try it later. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting presentation. Just a short question. What is your opinion on the intensity of the feedback? Will the intensity of the feedback impact how strong people avoid other types of dangers? Because, I mean, you could always exaggerate the feedback, right? Do you have any opinion on that?
So that's actually, thank you for your question. We discussed this a bit in the paper, because actually, so of course it can have a stronger feedback can have the effect of pushing the user away from the danger, but it can have also drawback, because if it's too intense and too exaggerated, user might start to, at some point, they still have to finish the task, right? And if you exaggerate too much and that prevent them to carry the task, they might just at some point start to ignoring the feedback. So I guess you have to balance well the feedback to make sure that they won't get to this point there they feel I cannot respect anyways the feedback, so I will have to injure my avatar. And of course that also depends on what you exactly want the user to do, how much you want to push them away from for the training task, what you exactly want them to expect them to do.
Yeah, I think in an industry training scenario that would be very interesting.
Yeah, that's one of
Thank you.
application we envision.
Thanks for that great talk. Okay, we're going to move on to the last talk in the session.
Sorry.
Thank you. Big Feet for Little People, given by Maggie McCracken.
Yeah, thank you, Jeanine, and thank you everyone for sticking around to the last talk before the reception today. I appreciate your patience. But yeah, I'm Maggie McCracken. I am a psychology PhD student at the University of Utah, and I'm really excited to be here today to share with you some of the developmental perception work we've been doing in VR. So every single day, we all have to judge affordances, and affordances are these perceived action possibilities within an environment. This might include walking through a doorway, it might include grabbing an object, and it might include stepping over something on the ground. And affordances are really special because we have this unique perception-action coupling. So these affordances are actually scaled to our capabilities as an observer and specifically scaled to our body dimensions. So we judge affordances based on the width of our shoulders. We judge whether or not we could grab an object based on the size of our hand. And finally, the work we've been doing in our lab is that you scale whether or not you can step over something to the size of your feet. So logically, if we're using these body dimensions to scale these perceived action possibilities, if we somehow artificially alter these body dimensions, we should theoretically also change these judged affordances. This becomes very easy in VR, especially with the use of virtual avatars, which is what we've done in our lab. So with adult participants, we gave adults either abnormally large feet or abnormally small feet. And we find that the adults who have these larger feet feel like they could step over a larger gap than the adults with the small feet. Now, affordances have been studied a lot with adults, but there's a special demographic that has remained sort of unstudied in affordance judgments, but specifically in like VR research in general, and that's children. So children are using VR more and more these days. And what we're really interested about this demographic group is that children, especially the children around ages 8 to 12, are nearing puberty. So children are experiencing rather rapid changes in their body dimensions, making it rather like unreliable scale that we typically use as adults. So this raises the question, when children have these sort of unreliable body sizes, do they actually scale affordances in VR similar as adults? And this becomes important when we talk about the evaluation of virtual environments using these affordance judgments. So to answer this question, we recruited 2 age groups of participants. So first we had our adult participants. This is just your typical undergraduate student population. And then we also recruited children, all between the ages of 8 and 12. Again, so these are children that are nearing or in the puberty stage. With these 2 age groups, we randomly assigned them to one of 2 foot size manipulations. So they either had small or large feet in VR. It's important to say that this is scaled to the participant's actual foot size. So we brought them in the lab. We had one of those little foot size measuring devices you see in the shoe aisle in department stores. So the small feet were 75% of the participant's actual foot size, and then the large feet were 50% of their actual foot size. So using these 2 virtual feet, we had our participants complete 2 tasks in VR, both of which I will explain in a minute, but it is important to say that this is an entirely between subject design. So participants only saw small feet or only saw large feet, and this is to keep them naive to our foot size manipulation in this study. So using a Vive Pro HMD, we had participants within this immersive virtual environment. It's just a plaza scene with kind of a grassy ground. In addition to the HMD, we also gave participants, I know they're trending now, but we gave them Crocs. And on the Crocs, we fixed Vive motion trackers to the toes. And this allows the participants to actually move their true feet and see those movements reflected in these virtual feet. So using these virtual feet, we had participants line their little toes up to that red line in the virtual environment. So the first task participants completed was a gap affordance task. So standing at that red line, we moved that blue line so it was various sizes of gaps, and participants provided yes, no affordance judgments as to whether they believed they could actually step over that gap. It's important to say that affordances are perceived action possibilities, so never are participants actually going through with this action. It's entirely verbal, again, action possibility. So to orient everyone to our outcome variable, we calculated crossover ratios. This is really popular in perceptual psychology literature, but we found for each participant the furthest gap they believed that they could fully step across. And then after the VR tasks, we actually measured participants' biggest step they can take. So you can kind of imagine it's kind of a funny motion we had participants do in the real world after. So what this crossover ratio means is any value less than 1 means that participants were underestimating their stepping ability, and a ratio over 1 means that they were overestimating their stepping ability. So starting with our results, with the adults first, so this is a direct replication of research we've done in the past in our lab. It's entirely as expected. You give adults larger feet, they think they could step over a larger gap. Makes sense. Moving on to the children, we find the exact opposite adults with children. We might have anticipated null results with children if they weren't actually scaling, but finding a complete opposite results as the adults is sort of surprising. So it kind of raises the question of like, what's going on with these kids? This is rather unusual. So one possibility that we considered is that the different foot sizes actually changed how big they thought those gaps were, which leads us to the second task we had all participants complete. And this is just a distance estimation task. So again, with their toes on that red line, we moved that blue line, and this time they provided verbal estimates to how big they thought that gap was. So it could be some sort of gap size, and they might say 2 feet or 24 inches or whatever it might be, whatever metric they're most comfortable with. And we had them do this for various different size gaps. So is this age-related difference due to differences in gap width perception? No. So it seemed like everyone was underestimating the size of the gap. So this is also making sense with the overestimation with the crossover ratio. So if they think the gaps are smaller than they are, they think they could step over a gap that's larger than they think. So because frequentist statistics cannot provide evidence in favor of a null hypothesis, we also provide statistical evidence with Bayesian statistics, with Bayes factors. So if you're not familiar with Bayes factors, a value less than 1 means that there's more evidence for that null hypothesis. So not only is there no difference, we have that statistics to back that up. The foot size manipulation, maybe with the children, you give them bigger feet, they think they're taller in VR. So after both of the virtual tasks, we had participants answer the question of, in VR, during the study visit today, did you feel like you were taller or shorter than you are in the real world? So just to orient yourself to the y-axis, a positive value here means that they feel taller than they do in the real world. Again, we're not seeing any sort of age group, foot size interaction here. It's interesting to point out everyone sort of felt like they were taller in VR, but again, no interaction that would explain what we found with the affordance judgments. Maybe children just don't have the same sense of ownership over the feet. Maybe they are kind of freaked out by virtual feet, which I don't blame them, and that somehow made them feel like they weren't truly their own feet. So we also had them complete a body ownership questionnaire. So these were various questions, 1 to 10, 10 meaning that they really felt like those feet were their own. Again, absolutely no difference. It's interesting that everyone, both children and adults, sort of had this pretty strong sense of ownership over these virtual feet, but nothing that would explain the age-related interaction we saw. And then finally, maybe children just don't perceive feet size in VR the same as adults, and although we didn't directly study this in our experiment, we did run a quick follow-up experiment to potentially answer this question. So we recruited the same 2 age groups but with a new subset of participants, and this time we gave participants various different foot size in VR, and using a controller we had them select what foot size they thought matched their own feet. So again, we measured their feet before entering VR, so it was all scaled to their true foot size. We shuffled the feet around after every trial, and they did this 5 times. Finally, absolutely no difference here. So everyone was overestimating the size of their feet in VR, but again, we're not seeing that age difference that would potentially explain this interaction we saw. So what do we do with this? I feel like as a scientist, we don't like to get null results, but I think this can be a really exciting part of science. First, we showed that children can judge affordances in VR. Affordances are a fantastic task to use with children because they are verbal judgments. They don't have to be walking around in VR. It's relatively simple, and today we show that children as young as 8 can accurately complete this task. We also show that children don't scale to body dimensions the same as adults. So you give children larger virtual feet, they think they could step over a smaller distance than if you were to give them small feet. We tested several different variables to hopefully explain this age-related difference. We found nothing. This does lead some potentially interesting future directions for us. So this age difference might be due to the HMD. So the HMD is proportionally heavier for children. So they may have been more reluctant to move their head and therefore see their feet at the same time as the gap. So that could be some fun head tracking stuff we do in the future. Additionally, the feet were completely disembodied, so we didn't have any virtual legs. That might have led children to using those feet to scale slightly differently as adults. And then finally, we know from a breadth of affordance research and navigation research and psychology that children often use different strategies to complete this task. So we hope to do some more like qualitative research in the future to hopefully answer the question of how are they actually cognitively processing this task. But again, nothing we showed today actually explains this result. But I don't want to end on a bummer. I think we should study children in VR. They're an increasingly popular group that are using this technology. So we can't just treat them like little adults. We need to recognize that we have these age-related differences, especially when applying these sort of immersive virtual environments in research applications, but also considering training or education materials or entertainment. And on that note, I would like to thank our lab and my authors for today, our funding agencies, and then I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Oh my God. Rock, paper, scissors.
We got all night. Go ahead.
Thank you. Very, very interesting talk. I wonder if you measure the body ownership of those children, and especially if they felt that those big feet were actually their feet and not like big shoes. Because if they felt like big shoes, it would change the way they feel about their own weight, or maybe they will feel that it's cumbersome, and so explain the result of a smaller gap they can cross.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think when we were running this experiment, we kind of interchanged the terms shoes and feet, and slightly assumed that if you're wearing shoes, your feet movements are, part of those. So we were hoping the motion trackers would sort of help study that problem a little bit. So if you're able to move your feet in the same way you move your actual feet, it's hard to do that in big shoes. Additionally, if you're wearing shoes smaller, your foot size has to show through eventually. But I think that's a good question and something we would love to consider in the future.
And children are especially used to have shoes that are not their feet size.
For sure. Yeah.
You're in charge.
Thank you. Great talk. So I also have a hypothesis. I wonder if it had something. No, I wonder how specifically you instructed people to think about crossing the gap. And my thought is that a difference between kids and adults is that kids tend to jump across gaps and adults tend to step across them.
Yes.
Could that have something to do with it potentially?
Yeah, no, excellent question. We specifically instruct participants, can you step across this while keeping both feet on the ground? I hate to demonstrate, but like a good step. Additionally, we also see that when we give the same instructions when we actually measure their true foot size, or their true step size. So we're hoping that sort of scales their judgments a little bit, but it could also be part of how they're perceiving these action possibilities, and who knows, maybe we want to do a jumping affordance task in the future that we might see the same pattern we do with adults here. Yeah, thank you.
Very interesting talk. Yeah, one nice thing about this research is it opens up a lot of interesting research questions, which is always a good sign of good research. One aspect I was thinking about is could potentially the difference, and you mentioned this with regards to perceived eye height, but could the actual eye height difference between participants could have made, could have actually impacted some of the results? If you were to make the eye height constant, for instance, between adults and children, could it have potentially produced different results? I wonder. And I had one other question as well, which is that if we provide participants, so one of the premise here in this research, as in a lot of research similar to this, is that the avatar or the potentially facilitating some sort of embodiment gives participants an egocentric ruler to judge distances such as gaps and things like that, right?
Yep.
So if it might be possible that children just don't know how to use that information very effectively, because I see that the variance is very large in children's responses.
Yeah.
So if they had the opportunity to calibrate to the embodiment that is facilitated via basically walking around in those big or small feet for some part of time before they make these judgments, could they have produced similar judgments to adults? I wonder. Thanks.
Yeah. All fantastic questions, and I think you bring up a lot of good points there. As for the eye height, everything in our experiment, we're scaling to the participants' own body dimension. So their eye height represents their true eye height in VR, and then their foot size, it's all scaled to the true foot size. So I think it's an interesting point, manipulating that eye height, and I do think that would change some of the results we have, even with the adults. So if you alter eye height, we see that it changes like step down affordances. So like that has been done in the past. So excellent question. I think we would love to do some eye height manipulation in the future. And then your second question regarding like calibration of action, I think brings up a really excellent point that we're just throwing them, these virtual feet on these participants, both the children and adults, and they don't get to actually walk around with that besides a few shuffle steps to get them aligned up for the position. So I think that's an excellent future direction we could go with this. And I might want to. Okay, apparently we've done that with reaching affordances too. So we might want to do like a conceptual replication of other methods with the stepping affordances. Yeah, thank you.
I was just going along with what Doug pointed out, where the way people perceive affordances was different. Here you said that participants had to keep one foot on the ground when they had to cross. Did you notice any of the kids trying to laterally cross the gap rather than frontally, like instead of like lunging forward, but laterally? Did you notice any of that? Because then your feet, the length of your foot probably would matter less, right?
For sure. Yeah. So within the instructions, we tell them, step straight across. So within the VR task, it's completely based on action possibilities. So never are they actually completing that step. That is only when we are actually measuring their actual abilities at the end. And that we can measure in any direction. So even if they are, some angular error with, some of the children like, really like to do the stepping measurement. We can kind of account for that with our measurement. We can ask participants to redo that again until we believe that is a true measurement of what we're trying to measure with stepping ability. But excellent question as well.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I'm wondering, so the children group was ages 8 to 12, and ages 8 to 12 can be a pretty variable group in terms of body proportions, you know, puberty and everything. I'm wondering if you did any kind of like maybe linear regression or anything on their age, on their direct age, to see if there was any kind of correlation with the actual number.
Yeah, excellent point, and definitely something we considered. We don't believe we have the sample size appropriate for that sort of analysis with this current group, but I think like an ideal experiment for us is to look at this both pre-puberty, during puberty, and post-puberty to represent these sort of developmental changes these children are going through. So although we didn't do that in this experiment, I think that is totally a variable that should explain some of the like large variability we saw in children, but we didn't do any sort of like within age group analysis here. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks everybody for sticking around for the last session. Speakers can stay here. If you have more questions, please feel free to ask them, and hope to see everyone at the reception tonight. Thanks for a great first day.